Thank you, Alex, for coming and joining this. So we have Alex Salazar is a partner at Neotribe Ventures, an early stage deep tech venture firm. Before becoming a venture capitalist, he was the founder CEO of Stormpath, acquired by Okta, where he built an authentication API service for developers and grew a bottom-up model that attracted thousands of developers every week. At Okta, as VP/GM of new products, Alex introduced a new IT product and scaled it from 0 to $9 million in sales in under 4 quarters. Alex holds a BS in computer science from Georgia Tech and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. So Alex, I'll let you get started today.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you so much, Allison. Well, hey, folks, this is a presentation I give often to founders because the number one challenge I run into when I talk to founders is everybody struggles with, let's call it early sales. You know, how to get those first 5 customers that are so critical to getting product market fit and proving to yourself and potential investors that, you know, you're onto something big. And the biggest reason everybody struggles with this is that so few people have sales backgrounds, especially when you're starting a technology company. Most founders are typically engineers, and sales to them is a totally different muscle. I come from an engineering background, and I was very privileged to accidentally have stumbled into sales before being an entrepreneur. And then within my own startup, and then within the organization that acquired my startup, I've really been exposed to and been quite successful in all the activities around getting early customers and then scaling out from there. So this presentation is really a discussion about the things that I believe are ways that founders like yourselves can get off the ground successfully without having to go hire a sales co-founder or go pay some consultant a large amount of money to help you. So there we go. A great place to start is, you know, I like to separate out 2 concepts that are common at the early stage. The first is if you've read books about, you know, lean startup or anything by Steve Blank around, you know, product market fit, there's a lot of discussion about customer discovery conversations. These are conversations with potential customers, not necessarily about selling to them, but to really understand their problem statements and what features would resonate with them so that you can get a sense of whether or not you're building the right thing for the right people. That's very different from sales, which is typically about finding customers who have the pain, are actively trying to solve it, and or going to pay you money. Now, at the very early stage, when you're trying to find your first customers, I find that the trick to this early selling is really a hybrid of both techniques. You know, going through that customer discovery process with the customer to make sure you are building the right thing for the right people, but in that same conversation, you know, having your ears peaked to see if there is demand. How do you get this customer to drop into a buying process with you, to then talk about money and then figuring out how they're going to transact or provide any other kind of commitments to you? And so what we're going to talk about in today's agenda are 3 major topics. The first is just really an exploration of how customers buy things. You know, in order to be a great salesperson, you really have to be great at understanding how customers buy, because at the end of the day, sales is really just an overlay to the customer buying process. The second thing is we're going to talk about probably one of the most challenging parts of sales is how do you get in front of customers? You know, how do you build and execute an outreach plan? And then the last thing we'll discuss is what happens when you get a customer on the call. You know, how do you handle that first phone call in a way that's going to get you value and also make the customer feel like it wasn't a waste of their time? And my goal of this session is that in your head, you'll either have, you know, a first version or a hypothesis on who your target champion is. We'll talk about that a little bit. A sense for what kind of outreach messages, you might try out, and a general rough framework of how you're going to operate a first call once you get in front of a customer. And my hope is that you can immediately start to apply this stuff tomorrow if you're at that stage in your startup where you want to start talking to customers. So how do customers buy? Well, probably the most challenging part and the most critical part of how customers buy is that customers really only buy things that they have an active need for. And so this is not an intuitive point for most founders, but a really critical one to internalize as you're talking to people. You might meet an organization and you might see that they have a need for your problem. For the sake of argument, let's say you're making some fancy new type of pen, and you believe that every employee at this organization is really going to greatly benefit from using your fancy new pen because it's faster, cheaper, lighter, more powerful, whatever. But if the employees at that organization aren't actively looking for an improvement to the pens they already have, or they aren't actively feeling the pain associated with not having your solution, it's going to be very hard to sell to them. And so, people will often use the term, customers want a painkiller, not a vitamin. Customers really only buy things for which there's a burning need. This is all getting at the same issue. If a customer doesn't see the problem as a high priority, and they don't see solving that problem as a high priority, it's going to be nearly impossible for you to get them to buy. As an anecdote, I consider myself a very good salesperson. I've been very successful in my career, and I can argue to you with a straight face that I've never convinced a customer to buy something that wasn't already a high priority for them. Now, that being said, there is room for you to educate the customer for them to realize that this should be a high priority. But let's say that that's outside the scope of this conversation, but something that's totally feasible. You can show a customer that there is a solution to something they didn't realize they had a solution for, and the business value was so great that they make it a priority for themselves. So when selling, the trick to being a good salesperson, and a salesperson that the customer likes to work with, is to really respect the customer's buying process. And so if you think of anything that you've purchased, let's say you've purchased a car. If you had a good buying experience, what probably happened was the salesperson was listening to you. They were really trying to understand where you were in your process. Maybe you were still in the information search phase. You knew you needed a car, but you were still figuring out what all the different models were. Or maybe you had already decided that you wanted this car, and so you were there to negotiate and make a purchase decision, and that salesperson was meeting you where you were. Alternatively, maybe you had a terrible sales experience and buying experience, and that typically manifests with the salesperson not listening to you and not meeting you where you are. You're trying to figure out if you want a sports car or an SUV, and they're trying to get you to transact right then and there on the spot. And it's those misalignments that really create bad experiences. And when you align really well, that's when you hear people talk about, salespeople being a trusted partner. This organization is a trusted partner. Even though they're trying to sell me things, we have a trusted partner relationship. And then for many products and many sales efforts, you're selling to an organization. And organizations buy in a very different way than consumers buy. When you decide you want a new pair of Nikes, there's a degree of impulse to that purchase. You like that pair of Nikes, you really want it. The ones you're currently wearing are a little ratty, so you're going to go buy them. You go on Amazon.com or Nike.com, you click a few buttons and you're done. Organizations don't buy that way, especially for larger ticket items. There's typically a decision group, formal or informal, right? There's the person who has decided that they have a problem, and maybe they're the ones who get to make the decision as to what we're going to buy. That person is different from sometimes the user, right? Let's say you're going to buy a new database, for the organization. The developers are all going to be influenced by that decision. The business analysts and the DBAs are going to be users of the system. But the person who makes the decision is the enterprise architect. But even then, the person who's going to pay for it is a different person entirely. It's going to be the VP of engineering. And so when it's time to make a decision and transact, all of these people are going to have some degree of say and influence over the decision. And the larger the transaction, the more complicated these buying units are, and the more that you and anybody in your organization will need to talk to these people and make sure that they're aligned with the decision to use your solution. So that's a general primer of how organizations buy, and we want to keep that in our heads as we then talk about how we're going to reach out to organizations to solicit interest and have those first conversations. So in this section, we're going to talk about executing that outreach plan. So if we take the conversation that we just had around how customers buy and these decision units, in that decision unit, the people involved in the decision, there's typically somebody who is going to be the internal champion. This is the person who's going to argue that the organization should buy your product. It's often the decision maker, but it might not be. It might be somebody else. Like, again, we'll use a database example. In an organization, maybe the enterprise architect is the one who gets to make the decision, but maybe there's a developer. It might be even a really young junior developer who feels really strongly that they should be using something like a MongoDB instead of a Postgres. And that developer is the one who's pounding the table and trying to convince everybody, and he's sending a bunch of articles and white papers. He's selling internally for you. And so, if you're lucky, it's actually the enterprise architect doing the same work instead. But regardless, you want to start to identify who these people might be. And these are typically people who are feeling the pain the most, or who are the biggest believers in your kind of solution. Then the thing you want to do next is really figure out what are the use cases. What are people going to do? In particular for technology solutions, you might have this great technology that's got all these great patents, but what is the organization going to do with it? Where are they going to use it? What are the business use cases or technical use cases that you're going to present to them to get them to get excited? You also want to get a sense of what the market segments are. Is this just for government? Is it just for financial services? Are you looking just at regulated industries? Or is this really for industries that are dealing with a lot of video, right? What are the different segments, however you slice it, that are going to give you a sense of where you're going to fish? And then also another big one is geography. Now, the truth is, we're very lucky to be in the United States. And so my little shortcut to geography as a venture capitalist is the answer is the United States. Because the market here is so big, buyers are much more advanced and more willing to take risks than buyers in any other countries, and they're willing to pay a lot more money. And so there needs to be a good reason for you to look externally outside the US, but in many cases that might be the answer. Maybe Latin America is your target market, or maybe Europe is your target market, maybe Asia is your target market, but really define that so you can really sharpen where you're fishing. And then the other one that's also pretty important and often misunderstood is company size. What you'll typically find is that company size is a pretty big filter for who you want to sell to. Are you trying to sell to the IBMs and the GEs of the world, the massive multinational conglomerates with hundreds of thousands of employees? Or are you trying to sell to mom and pops with a few dozen to 100 employees? Or are you trying to find mid-market companies, in the 100 to 1,000 range, or the slightly larger, mid-market enterprise, which is starting at around 1,000 employees? These may not be obvious to you at the beginning, but as you talk to more and more customers, you'll start to refine where you're getting the tug, and that'll help you solidify that targeting. And then the last piece is, some products, in particular technology products, have a dependency. A really basic one is, like if you have a cloud service, you're going to be dependent on people having high speed, reliable internet. But regardless of your technology, there typically are a bunch of dependencies. So I'll give you an example. There is a company in our portfolio that is building a solution for high performance data analytics. Fantastic product, really high value proposition. But as they're doing their targeting, it's heavily dependent on the customer already having some sort of data warehouse, like Amazon Redshift or Snowflake. And so with that understanding, they can really sharpen their targeting as they find their initial customers. Now, once you have this hypothesis of who your target champions are, who are those individuals who are most likely to get excited and where do they live, you will want to manufacture a little bit of experimentation to cast a bit of a wider net to see if maybe you're wrong. You might be surprised. Maybe this other market segment ended up being really excited about your solution that you didn't expect, right? Or maybe this dependency you thought was really hard and fast turns out it isn't. Or it turns out larger organizations or smaller organizations might care about what you're doing. And I'll give you a quick example. When I started my company, Stormpath, we were an authentication API for developers. We originally started out thinking that the only people that really needed our solution were going to be large, very security conscious organizations. And so we reached out to people like Boeing and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. So financial services, defense contractors were the people we originally went for, and very large ones. And we did get pull. We did get initial customers that way. It was pretty nice. But then we started to call on smaller organizations in search for more customers. And we found that everybody had this problem. It wasn't just the big, security conscious organizations. Turned out our market was much bigger than we expected. And so we then started to focus in on other company sizes. And then we got even more excited when we found out that in fact, the pull was actually bigger in the mid-market than it was in the large enterprise. And so we actually pivoted our strategy to go tackle the mid-market as our beachhead market. And then we eventually worked our way back up to large organizations. So create a little bit of an opportunity for serendipity as you start to reach out to people. We're not going to take a workshop break on this call, but I would urge you to, sit down with your co-founders, if you have any, and really start to think through who these target champions might be, bat it around, debate it with each other. And then, you may not feel super confident in your answers, in your hypothesis, and that's okay, right? Take an iterative approach. Take whatever answer you have, establish that as a hypothesis, and go test it. And I promise you, you're going to be wrong, which is great because that gives you the freedom to go make mistakes and iterate and improve it. My guess is that it'll probably take you 3 months and a few dozen conversations to really get to a place where you've sharpened it and made it accurate enough to really stand up with confidence and say, yeah, these are my target buyers. So the next thing is, okay, great. We've defined who our target buyers are. How are we going to reach out to them? What are we going to say? And so there's a lot of different ways of going about this process. But I like to really start with, what is it your product does? Which sounds like a really basic question, but surprisingly, it can be a very, very hard question to answer succinctly. And it can drive a lot of soul searching amongst founders of, well, what exactly is this thing? Especially if in your mind, your product is more of a platform where it can do a million different things. Really driving that down to a succinct line or two can be a really powerful yet challenging exercise. But what does your product do? Once you have that down, then the next thing is craft a very, very short outreach message that you're going to use on LinkedIn. This can be something as simple as, hey, Alex, I saw that you're an enterprise architect at Carnegie Mellon. We're working on this new type of non-relational database. Would love to show it to you. Can you spare 30 minutes? The point of the LinkedIn Connect message, we're talking about that in a bit, is you want to keep it really short, really succinct. And then you'll also want to craft an email message. Now this can be a lot longer, Right? People will read more on email. And this will be, depending on what it is you ultimately write, this may be something more about, hey, we're recent graduates from Carnegie Mellon. We're working on this really exciting research project that we're trying to commercialize. We'd love to take 30 minutes to talk to you. Here's our backgrounds. Or it might simply be instead, full value proposition. Hey, we're building this solution that does X, Y, and Z. We believe we're going to impact customers in these ways, and we'd love to take 30 minutes to walk you through. Here's some credibility about us, so you know that we're not yahoos. And so, again, we're not going to take a workshop break on this call, but I would urge you to really spend significant time on this. This exercise, even though you're really only creating, probably a page worth of content at best between the email, the LinkedIn message, and the very simple statement of what your product actually does, you'll find that creating these succinct, concise messages that kind of hit to the heart of what it is you do, who you are, and what you want are very, very challenging to write. Even the best product marketers, take their time to build these things. So sit down, show it to your friends, show it to your family, show it to people who look and smell maybe a little bit like who you think the target buyer might be, and have them give you feedback. Ask them, hey, does any of this make sense? Would you respond? And then once you have something that you're comfortable with, again, you're going to iterate. It's not going to be perfect the first time around. Go out and start to use it. So now we've got some basic messages. What do we do next? Well, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go build a list. Now, there's a lot of different ways of building the list. The easiest way that I know to build a list is to sign up for LinkedIn Sales Navigator. It does cost money, and there might be discounts out there available, but it is probably the easiest, best tool that I've seen. Now, there are others. There's another one that I've used before called Apollo.io, I believe. And so there's a number of these, but LinkedIn Sales Navigator is probably the easiest to start with. And what you're going to do here is, now that you've got a definition of who your target is, you're going to go in and go through their filters and go try and find those people. If you're looking for software developers who work in Java in the tri-state area in finance, that's a pretty easy search. And you can go find those people, and then you can refine and refine and refine as you learn more and more and get better and better at filtering. And you'll want to create a list. My advice is to create a list of 50 to start with. Don't boil the ocean. Just find 50. And they don't need to be the best 50. They need to be the first 50. So if you think it's Java developers in the tri-state area who work in finance, pull that list together and just start going through the results and just grab the first 50 that seem good enough and go run from there. Perfection is not your friend. This is really about getting the ball rolling. So once you've built that list of 50, you're going to want to grab each one, and you're going to want to do a little bit of research on who they are. Where did they go to school? What company they work in? What city do they live in? Do you know anybody in common? And you're going to want to personalize that, that message you're going to send to them. The biggest pro tip I can give you here is not a function of technique or writing. It's simply one of scheduling. The biggest pro tip here is that if you look at all the best professional salespeople in the industry, their biggest trick is that they simply have probably around 4 or more hours allocated on their calendar every week to do outreach. Not to build the list, not to respond to email, but to actually reach out to the people that they created a list for in some prior session. They have 4 hours to actually do that grind work of reaching out to people. And this is really important because this work sucks. It's emotionally challenging. It feels like a pretty big emotional bar. No one feels comfortable cold emailing or cold calling somebody. I haven't met a person yet who enjoys that work. And so if you don't book it on your calendar, and you don't make it purely around that, I promise you, you'll find reasons to you'll find excuses. You'll find reasons to procrastinate. And so when you're going through that outreach work in these 4 hours a week, or whatever time you decide to allocate, you should reach out to them in a number of different ways. You should be multi-channel. I find that LinkedIn connections are actually pretty good. I've had a lot of success. I probably have had most success just trying to connect with somebody on LinkedIn. And then when you click on the connect, it'll give you the option to send a personalized message. And then I drop that LinkedIn message we just wrote a few slides ago, and I drop that into that LinkedIn connection request. I don't send in mail. I don't have my friends on LinkedIn do the whole like introduction workflow. I just send a direct connection request with a message in it. And that's worked pretty well for me so far. In addition, email works pretty well too. Now in email, the one thing I'll urge you to do is that the trick to email is not to send one email. The trick to email is to ultimately set up a drip. You send the first email, hey, I'd love to meet with you, here's what we're working on. The person's unlikely to respond to the first email. So you send a follow-up email, hey, I sent you an email 2 weeks ago or a week ago or whatever, and I haven't heard back from you. We're working on this. I'd love to talk to you. I think your background's fantastic. I'd love to get your feedback. And then they may or may not respond to that one. And then like a week or two later, you respond again and be like, hey, I know you're really busy. This is the last time I'm going to reach out. Can you spare 30 minutes? And having those kinds of drips really increases the chances that someone's going to respond to you. But beyond, these direct messages, you should try and leverage your network. Do you have friends who know people? If they do, ping them directly in addition to the outreach and be like, hey, Susie, I know that you know Joe at Goldman Sachs. Can you please make an introduction? Or if you've already raised money from investors, leverage your investors. Like, hey, thank you for your capital. I'm going to need your network. Do you know anybody at these organizations? Do you know this person? Can you help me find a developer or an architect? Can you help me find a VP of X to go talk to because I want to go get validation? Make your investors work for you if possible. Professional investors like venture capitalists like myself, we spend a lot of our time doing this kind of work, so we're used to that request. And then the last thing I'll say here is that phone calls work. It's super awkward and super uncomfortable the first few times you try this, but I would urge you to put that arrow in your quiver. As you are doing these 4 hours of dedicated outreach, make some time to make phone calls. And the way that might work is, you've sent someone an email introducing yourself and asking for time, and maybe they responded, maybe they didn't. Well, probably they didn't. And then you call them maybe like a day or two later, maybe first thing in the morning or at the end of the day, and be like, hey, my name is Alex. I'm calling to follow up on an email I sent you. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but I'm a recent CMU grad, and I'm building this great piece of technology, and I'd love to get your feedback. Do you mind if we schedule 30 minutes to talk about it? And if not, is there anyone else in your organization you recommend we talk to? It can be something as simple as that. It can be a 5-minute phone call. It can be less than that. It can be a 1-minute phone call, but it works. The next thing is, you want to send follow-up outreach. We talked about this a second ago in emails. Whenever you reach out to people, don't let it be a one-touch. Just keep banging on them respectfully for a few weeks before you drop them from the list. Many people will respond at some point and tell you that they're not interested, and that's great. Some people will go completely dark and never respond to you. And so if you don't hear from them, let's call it after 3 weeks, after a few different outreaches, then you just take them off the list. And then because this exercise can be a bit of a grind for most people, you'd be very lucky if you really enjoy it. So, I hope so. Find a way of gamifying it for yourself. Reward yourself. I don't know if you've ever been to a sales floor, but maybe you've seen, dramatizations of a sales floor in movies. There's a lot of excitement and activity that happens on sales floors, right? People are ringing bells, there's horns, people are celebrating all kinds of things. That's not an accident, right? The reason they do that is because exercises like this are so hard emotionally that really good sales managers know that they need to reward every little win of their salespeople in order to keep them motivated and keep them performing at their best. And so take that trick and apply it to yourself. What are you going to get really excited about? Maybe you love playing video games, right? Say, okay, look, I'm not going to play this new favorite video game that I have until I go make, 4 hours of outreach. Or, maybe you treat yourself to a gift or a trip or something, whatever it takes, just to get yourself to get through this work and then reward yourself at the end so that you have the motivation to do it again next week. Now, there's a lot around this topic of outreach. And so I would say that if you want to learn more around outreach, there is a book that I recommend called Fanatical Prospecting. I don't really recommend most sales books. I find most sales books are pretty garbage. But I actually recommend this book. It's the way it's written is sometimes a little funky, but the tips, the recommendations, the frameworks, I think are pretty on point. And so if this is something that you want to build a core competency around, this is a great place to start. Okay, so you've done all this outreach. You've been at it for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and all of a sudden people are starting to respond. Now, I will say this, I will promise you, people will respond. You will be surprised. If you've never done this before, you will be pleasantly surprised by the fact that people will start to respond. It won't be the majority of outreach, God willing it is, but it's unlikely to be the majority. But this is not a game of batting averages. This is not about your hit rate. This is more of a game of home runs. This is all about how many home runs do you get, how many calls do you get, regardless of how many outreaches you took. So focus on the successes, don't focus on the percentage wins. So someone says, you know what? I'd love to take a call. What do you do? So let's talk about that. So the first thing you got to do is you have to prepare, right? Now, this sounds obvious, but I'm telling you, it is probably one of the biggest places I see even professional salespeople fail, is they just go onto the call and they wing it. And that is it. That, if you fail to prepare, be prepared to fail. So how do we prepare? Well, the first thing is you really want to do your research. If you're talking to head of HR at a multinational, then go do your work. Go find out about that person. Have they written anything? Do they have any social media presence? Where did they work before? Where did they go to school? Go figure out as much as you can about that person as you reasonably can within a reasonable amount of time. And then also go into the industry. Let's say you're talking to a large global manufacturer. Well, go learn about that manufacturing industry. Right? Go learn about, let's say they're doing solar panels. What's the latest state of solar panel manufacturing? Understand the context that they might be bringing to the conversation. And then also understand their company. Understand their products, but also understand how you might fit into their story. Now, you don't really know because you haven't talked to them yet, but start to run through where you might fit. Next thing is you want to set an objective for the call. What's the point? What is your goal? What are you really trying to get out of the call? Are you just trying to get an introduction to the right person? Are you trying to get feedback on your solution? Or are you trying to see if they want to maybe be one of your lighthouse or pilot customers when you're a guinea pigs? Or is there some other goal that you're looking for? Write it down, really have a good, crisp understanding of that going into the call. And the other thing that's going to happen is you want to try and think through what are all the possible things they might say that might potentially throw the call off. They might have objections. Hey, a solution like yours is great, but I don't have the money. Well, think through what you might say in a solution, in a scenario like that. Or, hey, that's really great, but I already own this other product. You've got a great data warehouse, but I already own an Oracle system. What's your response to that going to be? Really visualize how a call might go, all the twists and turns it might take, and just start to think through how you'll handle them. When you first start this process, it may feel like you're taking a few shots in the dark. But after a few conversations, especially after you go through your first dozen, you'll start to see patterns of what customers are going to throw at you. Right? You'll start to hear consistency around the objections or challenges they'll throw at you as you start to describe what you do and how you might help their organization. Then it'll be easier and easier and easier for you to prepare for how to handle those. So then you've prepared, now the call's happening. How do you open that call? How do you start a meeting in a way where you've increased the odds of you getting what you want and the customer feeling that it was a good use of their time? Well, the first thing is you want to make sure that you've interacted with the customer in the right ways leading up to this meeting, right? How did you show up? Were you dressed appropriately? If you're talking to an investment banker and they wear a suit and a tie to every meeting, did you show up in a t-shirt? You don't want to do that. How did you interact with them? Were you polite and courteous and highly responsive in the scheduling and answer any questions they had before the meeting? You want to make sure that even before the first words coming out of your mouth and that call happened, you've shown up, in every other way as well as you can. Next thing, I'm a big fan of just telling the customer what the goal of the meeting is. You probably already did this work in the preparation. Be like, hey, Catherine, very excited to have a conversation with you. We've got about 20 minutes. My goal for this conversation is to walk you through what we're working on and really better understand how it might fit in your organization. I'd love to get your feedback. Is that okay with you? You do want to try and confirm your competence. Why are you worth talking to? Look, I'm the principal researcher on this technology, and I'm trying to see, where the market opportunity is for it. Or I'm the founder CEO of this organization, and I'm looking for my initial customers. I have 20 years of experience in industry XYZ, and I'd love to really understand how you're solving these problems. Whatever it is that's going to make them feel like they're talking to the right person, run with it. And the good news is that if you're trying to start a company, by virtue of you being a founder, that's a minimum bar, a sufficient minimum bar for articulating competence on a call. And then from there, you want to get through this opening phase as fast as possible. Because the next thing you want to do is you want to get them talking. The goal of a sales call is not to pitch. Instead, it's to ask. You want to understand as much as possible about what they're doing and what they're trying to solve and how you might fit as humanly possible. You want to listen. So get them talking quickly. So how do we get them talking? So there's a million different ways of handling a sales call. But, to my earlier point, I believe at the early stage, you really want to merge the concepts of customer discovery as laid out by people like Steve Blank and other people. He's got a wonderful book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. But if you take the models of customer discovery as you're trying to identify and validate product market fit, and then I like to take that model and overlay sales goals and sales questions and sales qualification exercises into them. And so this is what this looks like. This is one of many models. If it doesn't feel natural for you, don't follow it. But it's worked for me and something I show portfolio companies. So the first thing you want to do is you want to get the customer talking about their problems. The way that I have found this to work best is I'll present the customer with the problems I believe they have. And it'll be something like this. Hey, Susan, we've been looking a lot at, what the data science team at media companies are working with. And in talking to a number of other customers, a number of other organizations and teams like yours, we've kind of come to a hypothesis that, teams like you, people like you are struggling with these 3 problems. You don't have, you're struggling to get the data into the service fast enough. You are struggling with how long it takes to run complex, large queries. And you're constantly battling the issue that you're getting all these requests from line of business people, and that's really jamming up all the work you're doing. And then you turn back to them. It's like, are these the right problems? Are these the most important problems you're dealing with right now? Did I miss something? Did I get something wrong? Have them validate this. and have them correct it if it's wrong. And at first, you're going to get a lot of corrections. You're going to learn a lot. Customers are going to barf all over your initial problem statements, and you might feel pretty small in that process, but it's actually wonderful. They'll say, well, that's not really what I'm still struggling with. What I'm really struggling with is X, Y, and Z. And when they start to explain that, dig in, ask a ton of questions until you really understand it, at a minimum for just that customer. Over time, you will start to see patterns, and this will get a lot easier, but at the beginning, just become really, really curious. If you get past this stage in the conversation, and you probably should, you'll then want to validate what you believe are alternative solutions. Well, hey, Susan, now that I understand your problems, our understanding is that you are solving this today in one of three ways. You're either just simply like dealing with it, or maybe you're just simply throwing human bodies at it. You're just hiring more people to account for these problems, or you're using this other product solution. And here are the problems that you're running into with these alternative solutions. Hiring people, you can't find enough data scientists in the market, and when you do find them, they're like $500,000. This Oracle product that you purchased that you thought was going to solve the problem is really clunky and nobody really likes using it. Or you don't have a solution and it's causing all these downstream problems. Like, your alternatives suck, and here's why we think they suck. And then again, same thing, have them tell you if you're right or wrong, have them validate this. Again, at the beginning, they're going to crap all over this. They're going to tell you all the reasons why you're wrong. And again, jump in, get curious, really understand where they're coming from and whether or not they're happy with alternative solutions. A really important point in this particular piece is, it's okay if a customer is really happy with their existing solutions. Right? Your goal isn't to convince somebody that what they have isn't good enough. Right? They might come to that conclusion when you run them through your solution, but your goal is really discovery. You really just want to understand. And not every customer is going to need your product, no matter how great your product is. It's just a fact of sales. And so if this customer is just really happy and content and they don't have a problem and this is not a priority, that's an okay outcome, right? Now, okay, this is not going to be a customer. You can move on to other customers and go find people who really do have burning problems that you can solve. So assuming you get past this and you really understand how they're trying to solve these problems today, you can then start talking about what it is you're planning on building. Talk about your solution. And here too, say, look, we're going to go solve this problem for organizations, and we're going to do it by building, this, modern cloud-hosted high-performance data warehouse. And here are the three major features we're going to have. Right? We're going to have super fast response time for large queries. We are going to be cloud hosted so that you don't have to work with IT to go manage and configure this thing. As a result, it's going to be more secure and more highly available. And it's going to be really easy for you to collaborate with line of business executives, because we're going to give the business people this wonderful dashboard for them to go in and run some of their own basic queries, or go see the results of the queries that they gave you. Whatever the features are for the product that you have in mind. Keep this list small. You really want to be focused on the most important features. And there too, ask the customer, how compelling are these? If I did 1, 2, and 3, how excited would you be? Would this solve the problem? For feature 1, what would the benefit be? The trick to this part of the conversation is, again, you're not trying to convince them that feature 1, 2, 3 are going to change their life if the customer doesn't already believe it. What you're trying to do is you're trying to understand if feature 1, 2, 3 are going to change the customer's life. Hey, if we had feature 1, what would that mean for you? What would the impact be? Ideally, you can boil this down to amount of money you're going to save them, or amount of money you're going to help them make. But it might be something that's a bit more of a softer value proposition, like they're going to spend a lot less time on something, or it's going to improve their security posture. You really understand their perceived value. And yes, you can help guide them a little bit, but for the most part, it's really about understanding. Now, this is where sales comes in. So far, what we've really gone through here is a pretty straightforward standard discovery call framework. But if at the end of this, you see that the customer is biting, they're getting excited, they're like, you know what, Alex, this is a big problem. And here, I have problem 1, 2, and 3 that are a high priority. I struggle with them every single day. And the solutions that I have just suck. They're really expensive. They don't work. I'm really dissatisfied. And you know what? Like if you did 1, 2, and 3, that would be really exciting. Like I'm really interested. If you start to get that kind of response, then you start to dip into sales mode. And because you're early and you're unlikely to already have a product and a sales team and pricing already in place, you have this opportunity to ask crazy questions. And so I would urge you to ask them the big question, which is, would you pay me $1 million? The answer is going to be no. No one's going to pay you $1 million. Let's be clear about that. But find a number at the edge of reason, right? Is $1 million for a product reasonable? Well, it depends what kind of product, right? People spend more than millions of dollars on data warehouses. And so asking someone to pay you $1 million for a data warehouse isn't the craziest number. But you want something that's at the edge of reason because you want to get the customer thinking. You don't want a no, like you don't want to say, would you pay me $100? Because then it's too easy for them to say yes. So you want something at the edge of reason, and you should expect to hear no. The whole point of throwing this number out is you want them to say no. But not like an outrageous no, but you want something that's going to say no. And then you can ask a question, okay, well, what price would make sense? And the reason you want to do this is because you've now gotten the customer to stop and think. And then they're gonna run through math in their head. Now, what that math is, you'll find out when you talk to them, but you want to understand that math. How is it that they're going to justify some price? How are they going to rationalize whether or not you're worth $1,000, $100,000, $1 million? They're going to start running through out loud and be like, well, I'm currently spending, 3 headcount to solve this problem. And so if I do the math fully loaded, once I include benefits, it's really costing me about $500,000 a year. And I'm not going to pay you $500,000. I can't really replace these people. I can't just fire them. So, ballpark, I could probably pay you 100 or 200K. Now, the number's great, right? Big number, you like that. But that's not really the goal. The goal is you now just understood how somebody's thinking about ROI. And that's critical because then as you talk to more and more customers, you're going to be smarter and smarter and smarter about how to talk to them about the value you're going to deliver to them. And if someone throws a number out that's remotely interesting, you now know you have a qualified customer. This person is biting. And we'll talk about what to do after that. So sometimes a customer's going to struggle to give you that answer. They're going to be like, well, I don't really know. I don't really handle the budget. I'm not really in charge of purchase decisions. I'm just a lowly developer. So I really have no idea. I'm really uncomfortable giving you a number. I don't know. And that's okay. You're going to hear that a lot. When that happens and someone gives you a non-answer, or even they say no, I think another great big question is, what if I made it free? Now, you're not going to give your product away, or maybe you are, but you're probably not going to give your product away. And asking someone if they would use it for free ends up being this really critical question because you start to learn if you're delivering any kind of value at all. What you'll find is when you're selling to enterprises is that just because a product's free doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything, right? They got to integrate it, right? That costs time. That's really hard work for an organization. They've got to train their people. They've got to go through some sort of change management process, right? Even if your product's free, it's still going to cost them money. And so by asking this question, you really get a really big insight into whether or not there's enough value on the table for them to even go through that work alone. And if you hear no, ask them why. Really get curious, understand where you're falling short. Is it that they don't have the problem? Is it that your solution sucks? Is it that the alternatives are too good? And if they say yes, same thing. dig in. Well, why would you do it? What's the value you would experience? Push them. Be like, but integrating is kind of a pain. You're probably gonna have to spend 2 weeks of an engineer's time wiring this up to some other system. Like, why would you go through that work? And then have them explain to you why they think there's enough value here to go after this. So you're running short on time. The call's almost over. You're going to read the room. Was this person leaning into what you're building, or were they leaning out, right? Did they start telling you that, yes, they would pay you? Or were they like, look, it's not even worth it if it's free, or I don't know, this is not a problem, I'm the wrong person, whatever. If it's a dead end, just thank them for their time. Or alternatively, if you're just simply talking to the wrong person, ask them for other introductions. Maybe they were a dev working on the project that isn't relevant to your product. So you're like, okay, well, hey, can you mind introducing me to the team that is relevant? Or maybe it's just not gonna be relevant in the organization at all. Be like, hey, look, it doesn't sound like your organization needs this, but do you have friends who work at other organizations who you think may be willing to talk to me? Get introductions. It's gonna make that outreach process that much easier as you talk to more people, because now you're getting warmer and warmer introductions from the very customers you've started talking to. Now, if someone is interested, well, this is where it gets really exciting. Summarize what you heard from them. Hey, Rebecca, this is fantastic. What I heard from you is you have problem 1, 2, 3. You're really unhappy with the solutions you have for X, Y, Z reasons. And if we build this product with feature, A, B, and C, you would be excited to use this, and you think you could probably justify paying, $50,000 a year for it. Did I follow that right? And then propose, hey, you know what? We're early stage and we're looking for pilot customers. If we can make an arrangement where this was attractive to you financially, would you be interested in exploring being one of our first customers? And then you want to set up what the next steps are. You want to propose that follow-up meeting with the right people. If you go back to that concept we've laid out earlier around decision-making units in an organization, you're going to want to figure out who the right people are for that deeper conversation. Maybe it's that person's manager. Maybe it's some other really important decision maker, like an enterprise architect or a head of HR or director of sales or whatever it is for your product. Ask that person to help. And if you may not know, ask that person for guidance. Hey, who are the other people in addition to you who would be relevant to this decision? Can we get a meeting with them to really get a deeper dive and see if we're a fit? Now, through any sales call, you're going to get objections. People are going to say, oh, it's too expensive, or, I already own XYZ, or, you guys are just a startup and, we can't trust you. You're going to get all these reasons why someone doesn't want to use you or can't use you. This is counterintuitive, but it's actually a really good sign. It means that the person is thinking about what you're telling them. I would rather have a call where the person is throwing objection after objection every 30 seconds than I would have a call where the person doesn't say anything. Because if they're not saying anything, it means they're not paying attention, they've checked out, or they've written you off. Objections means that they're engaged. So when someone throws an objection like, hey, I don't have the budget, this is too expensive, step one is just listen, right? Like dig in, oh, hey, I hear you, you don't have budget. Can you elaborate? How does budget work here? Is it, do you don't have budget because budget's already been allocated for the year? Do you not have budget because you're the wrong person? Is there a different person who would have the budget for this? Then once you understand this, whatever the objection is, acknowledge it. Okay, I get it. Like, you don't have budget, or I get it. Yeah, you're right. I could see why you would think this is an expensive solution. Or you're right, we're an early stage startup and there is a risk in working with us. And then really explore as much as you can the issue. Flesh it out and then respond. And there's a million different ways to respond. One way to respond is to simply accept that it is true. You're right, we are a startup. You're right. Like, we would require payment. And so we would need to work with you to figure out budget. Or you're right, our product does seem kind of expensive to some organizations, depending on the value you have. But another more common response is you might want to handle the objection. Be like, you know what, I hear you, it's expensive. You're right. But the value, if I heard you right, the value we can bring to you as an organization is we can help reduce all these other costs. And so yes, while this does come with a big ticket, we're going to reduce the cost by 2x in the first 6 months. And so if I can prove to you that we're going to help you save more money than the product costs, would you still be interested in working with us? The point here I'll make on handling objections is that there was a study, I forget the name of the organization, I think Harvard was involved. They did a study of the best salespeople. They inventoried a bunch of salespeople and they really figured out like what made a great salesperson. Do they have the great relationships? Do they know the products really well? And the number one thing that stood out above all was they were really good at handling objections. They were prepared. They kind of knew what objections were. They had, they already had some basic answers in their heads, and then they were really good at listening to the customer, acknowledging the problem, really like digging in a bit more, and then responding. And so as you are learning how to do all this stuff, I would make sure that you pay special attention to your skills developing around handling objections. So that's it. This isn't rocket science. It's hard work. It's very hard work, and for some people it can be emotionally challenging because you're doing really uncomfortable things. But it's not complicated. It's just work that has to get done and work that has to get scheduled. And if you do it, it's really powerful because you're going to learn a ton about the market for your product, and you're going to find customers. To give you a sense of scale, when we started our company, it took about 60 customer conversations for us to really get a dialed in view of who we were going to sell to, who our first customers were going to be. It takes dozens of customer calls to get, I think, a strong product market fit off the ground. And you guys and based on this, because it's not rocket science, I would argue that you're ready now, right? You've got the tools to go figure out who your champions are. Building a list on LinkedIn is hopefully now, pretty straightforward and demystified. Building an outreach message, you now have a basic framework that you can execute on. Now you've got my opinion of what a good framework is for this early stage where you are still a startup and don't necessarily have like finished product to go sell. So my advice is, the next best thing is to just get out and do it. Get out and work this muscle. You're not going to get it right the first time, and that's okay. But the more you keep trying and the more you iterate, the better and better you're going to get. And you're going to be very surprised as to how good you're going to get at it after you've done this a few dozen times. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Q&A. Allison, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thanks, Alex, for doing this. This was great. And I don't see any questions in chat right now, but does anybody have any questions for Alex today?
I have a quick question. I'm sorry, my camera decided not to work. I'm curious, how do really cutting-edge innovations fit into the great framework that you introduced? I can see how it fits fantastically on most of the projects that I'm collaborating with. On the other side, I'm also thinking about something that's truly innovative, maybe beyond imagination of people. Like one example would be having ATM machines. When they were thinking about introducing them and they asked people, would you use a machine? People were saying in the research, I would never trust a computer to give me money because they were used to a teller. And now we have ATMs on every corner. Another example, maybe Elon Musk's project. Maybe if we tried to validate early, like people would be saying, like, this is a ridiculously expensive car. I don't have a need for Tesla, or I don't want to fly to Mars. But maybe in a few years, many of us will be space tourists, or other examples like Uber, spending many hours on social media, Airbnb. So do you have any thoughts on like these outliers?
I do have a lot of thoughts. This is a great question. Thank you for asking it. So, so we as a firm, my job all day is to go invest purely in breakthrough technologies. You know, we are typically investing in things that are coming straight out of R&D, and they're not incremental. And so we run into this problem often. I would argue that you can, and I would argue strongly that you should go through a process like this either way. And I'll give you a few examples. So let's do Elon Musk and Tesla. If you ask the average American if they would pay you, twice the price for an electric vehicle that has half the range, and you've got to go buy an energy supply to go plug it in, you're right. Most people would have said no. But that's not what they built, right? If you looked at what Tesla really started with, their first car was not designed for the average American, right? Their very first car was this little modified version of a Lotus, and they were going after car enthusiasts. Hey, what if I get you a car that had better acceleration than a Porsche 911 Turbo, and roughly the same price, maybe a little bit more, and it's fully electric, right? So you don't have to worry about gas, and it looks really cool because it's basically a Lotus. It's basically a boosted up go-kart. Would you buy that? And that's what they sold. And that's what they ultimately went to market with. And then from there, as the market changed, the market started to realize there was more and more there as they were able to bring their costs down. They then started to get into the more mass market cars. And they didn't get into the Model 3? They didn't get to the Model 3 for like a decade. And so I would argue that this framework is really important because it'll help you, or a framework like this, you don't have to use mine, it'll help you find out where your beachhead is. Because at some point, your startup has to find revenue. You have to find the first 5 customers. And if you can't, then you're not a company, you're a research project. And if you're gonna be a research project, that's okay too. That should be funded in different ways. But if you're trying to commercialize it and build a startup that's gonna generate revenue, you need to figure out where that beachhead is gonna be. Same thing with SpaceX, right? Elon Musk had this crazy idea about, re-entry, reusable first stage rockets. Well, that sounds like a science fair experiment, but in reality, there's a lot of people who can't launch the satellites they need to launch because the cost is too high with traditional launch systems. And so, hey, if I could launch cheaper because I can reuse part of my rockets, would you launch with me? The other thing I'll say is the one caveat to all of this is if you're selling something to consumers. You gave the ATM example. You and I can nerd out all day on the origins of the ATM, but you're right. I mean, consumers may have said, no, I don't want an ATM. I would never trust a computer to give me money. Consumers are weird. This framework that I laid out is really more for, you selling to organizations. Organizations have the benefit of being very rational in the way they purchase, in part because no one person gets to make a purchase decision without oversight. So, the fact that multiple people tend to be involved tend to keep the decision a bit more rational. Consumers are a bit different, and there's very different kinds of strategies to go figure out what consumer demand might look like. I think Eric Ries has a few suggestions in Lean Startup, but I would say that consumer sentiment and consumer demand is outside the scope of this presentation, a conversation I'm happy to have offline.
Wonderful, thank you. This is very useful, and I just want to iterate. I love the framework. I'm collaborating with multiple startups, so I'll definitely start utilizing some of the additional suggestions you had.
Oh, my pleasure.
Hi, this is Z. Sorry, my camera is off. First of all, nice arts in the background. Really enjoyed watching them. I have a question about pricing, and thanks for covering major parts of pricing and budgeting. I was wondering if there are any resources for finding out how much companies are spending on similar software essentially, is there a way to figure out how much they're budgeting for marketing if your software is in marketing, or how much they're spending on X if your market is X, right? That's my question. Because Googling is really hard, but there might be some resources that because you're investors. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And I wish I had a great answer for it. My experience is that it's really hard to get this data publicly. And while you might get it, you might find some analyst report that gives you some sort of number. It's almost always just not trustable. It's either just too averaged out. My strong advice is to ask the question as you're talking to customers. So one of the things we didn't talk about here is, time permitting on these calls, you might lean more into customer discovery work and a little bit less into sales, or vice versa, right? It just depends on where you are as a startup. And so if you have really big open questions that you need to know the answers to, you might spend time on these calls to ask them. And so you might say, hey, maybe somewhere, wherever you think it's the best fit in a conversation, be like, hey, how much do you have budgeted for marketing software? What's your marketing budget? Oh, our marketing budget is X. Okay, well, how much of that is software? Oh, it's actually this. How much of that's ads, right? How much of that's headcount? My experience is you'll get so much more by just having the direct conversation with customers, and you'll also find, I suspect, that it's gonna vary pretty widely between organizations and industries.
So once you know the budget, let's say their budget is $2 million for X. So how would you price your software? Would you still think about, okay, my software is going to give them this much impact, so it's going to be worth maybe $300,000? Is that how you think about?
Yeah, pricing strategy is hard. So the first point I'll make on pricing is you will never get your pricing right. For the life of your company, you are going to be battling pricing. But look, there's a lot of different ways of pricing. My bias is to price based on value. And so try and figure out what it's worth to them. What's the impact going to be? And then price that way. Yes, understanding how much they're paying for alternative solutions is really valuable, because you'll know we need to come in above or below. And that'll help you triangulate. But there's no hard and fast rule. If you think you're going to save them $200,000 a year, then you kind of know you can't charge them more than $200,000 a year. If they're paying if they're paying $50K for a comparable solution, that's good to know. You might come in above that number if you are more valuable, or you might come in below that number if you believe you're going to disrupt this market through a cheaper solution, right? There's many ways of going about this.
I see.
But I'll tell you, my shortcut to all of this is, if you're selling a product to an organization, the price is $50K.
Thank you.
You're going to go through all this work. I promise. And you're going to go through all this work, and at the end of the day, you're going to wake up and you're going to realize that the number needs to be $50K. And there's all of these reasons for it. But what I would urge you to do is, test out numbers that start at $50K, and just see what people say.
Awesome.
Find that for enterprise products, life gets really hard if you can't generate at least $50K per account. And so you'll wanna try and manufacture that. And then you'll wanna constantly be testing if you can charge more. Hey, they say yes to 50, we'll be like, what if it was 100? They say yes to 100, be like, what if it was 200? Because what you'll need to do over time, if you're building a product for enterprise, for organizations, is larger organizations, is you'll need to see line of sight to, in some future, some of your accounts paying you over $1 million a year. Now, you won't get there in the first 5 years of the business, but you'll want to just have a sense of what it would take to get there. I don't know if that's helpful, but
super helpful. And another question related to this entire talk: when do you hire salespeople?
Ah, man, what a great question. Hiring salespeople is honestly one of the hardest things a startup will do once they get past this phase. I would urge you to wait to hire your first salesperson until you know already how to sell your product. The thing about salespeople, everybody thinks a salesperson is going to show up and they're going to figure out how to sell your product. What people don't realize is that's not all salespeople do. Most salespeople at most organizations show up and they're handed a playbook. You know, they're handed a playbook day one of their job and says, here's how you sell this product. Go execute. And they go run the process, some of the, you know, variation of the process I just ran you through, but they're not the ones in charge of figuring out what the value proposition is, who the target customer is, you know, how to jump from step A to step B in the sales process. That's not what most salespeople do. There's a different team in larger software organizations, typically called product marketing, that actually puts these playbooks together for the reps. The reps show up and they just simply execute. And so if you bring a rep in too early before you know how to sell your product, they're going to fail.
Excellent point. Yeah.
I would say try and get your first 5 customers. Try and get some sense of repeatability in the story and the process. It doesn't need to be perfect, but enough where you feel some degree of confidence that you can go hire this really hardworking salesperson, hand them, you know, this nascent playbook, and go have them execute on it.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And do we have any other questions today? Okay. Well, thank you, Alex, for coming. And